The great thing about gacha games is that everybody here is illiterate, so no one can really tell you that you're wrong about stuff. We're doing some Amber Room theories today. Right, so just to start, I cannot stress enough that these are just theories. Their foundations may be shoddy at the best of times, and are more just trains of thought rather than anything really concrete, so take it all with a grain of salt. Now, let's go ahead and just begin with, what is the Amber Room? If you were to close your eyes right now and think about the concept of an Amber Room, what would come to mind? And I'm sure that after some thought, most of you would come to the same conclusion, and you are most probably correct. The Amber Room is white. Though it may sound like a bit of a misnomer, I think amber refers more to the function of the room rather than its appearance. The preservation of something from the tides of time, like an insect caught in a piece of amber for millions of years. The Amber Room serves a similar purpose, albeit kind of in the reverse. Rather than perpetually preserve something, they are instead trying to reverse that thing to a previous state. In a sense, the preservation of an era that has long since been wiped away. Which then brings us to the first theory. Number 1, the Amber Room is a storm reversion experiment. And this one is less a theory and more just outright stated, but it's good to cover the basics, right? Igor was tasked with finding the anomalous people, that is to say, those who came back wrong after the reverse. He brings them to the room, after which they exit as a husk of a person. The experiment itself is called vessel ensoulment, which, just on its face reads as shoving a soul into a vessel, current contents notwithstanding. And finally, with Erd, it is very directly stated that these experiments were a means to find her true self. Put it all together, and it seems that the vessel ensoulment experiments are seeking a means of taking an anomalous person and somehow returning their original soul, the person they were prior to 1999, with the failure of this experiment leading to a vessel with no soul at all. Number 2, the Amber Room is the reason for the Storm Reformation Act. Now, these two things seem rather disconnected, but let's go ahead and just take a look at the timeline real quick. Igor states that Erd, or at least an iteration of Erd, had been found and taken to the Amber Room for experimentation after the Sixth Storm, and this aligns with the opening of the game, as the Sixth Storm is the first one that we as the player experience. You know what else happens at the start of the game and after the Sixth Storm? Well, Chapter 4 does, the fight for the Storm Reformation Act. And technically this is actually after the Seventh Storm, but the Seventh Storm was only a 2-day affair, so, not much time to get things done there. Now, there is a scene in Chapter 4 that at the time seemed rather out of nowhere, right? The president of the Foundation makes a brief appearance, meeting with Constantine prior to the final vote for the act. He reappears after what is implied to be an extended period of seclusion and tells Constantine something. Right, the actual words remain unspoken, but what she hears leaves Constantine shaken to the point that she can barely even stand. What follows then is a hasty last-minute revision to the Storm Reformation Act. Revisions that seemingly are designed to push the act towards approval among its detractors, with the chairwoman mentioning that a similar revision had actually been submitted by another delegate earlier. Or, in other words, this sudden push for approval regarding Arcanist rights seems manufactured. So, what's the deal? Why Constantine's sudden switch up? Well, Erd's experimentation aligns with the time Chapter 4 would have been going on, and I imagine the president of the Foundation would have a high enough clearance to be privy to such things. We also know that at some point following her experimentation, Erd escaped containment. Now, to give expanded rights and greater agency to the Arcanist means that the Foundation gets to have another autonomous arm to enact its will without necessarily spending quite as much manpower, and previously the trade-off may have been too steep as it would require, actually giving Arcanist rights. But now something has seemingly balanced that equation. That is to say, the disappearance of a vital piece on their board. And this would mean that all of this, right, sending Burton to Sao Paulo, to Antarctica, to Beograd, was all planned. Though she believes she is acting of her own agency, it's all been a ploy to retrieve a missing Foundation asset. She has just been dancing to someone else's tune, despite her belief that she is working on her own. Number 3, Burton is a superpositioned entity. Now, I am the furthest thing from a quantum physicist, but in the most layman of layman terms, for something to be superpositioned means it exists in all states simultaneously. Not entirely correct, but for our purposes, it works. Now, what I'm suggesting isn't necessarily that, but something close, in which Burton exists across all time and all timelines synchronously. This would explain then why the storm does not affect her in the first place. It isn't necessarily that she's immune, so much as regardless of where or when the storm takes her, an identical iteration of her already exists then and there, and thus she experiences no change. We saw something that may resemble this with Erd in the Amber Room, where, for a brief moment, iteration upon iteration of her possible existences manifested in tandem. The thing is, the scientists overseeing the ensoulment experiment mentioned that this was the closest anyone had gotten to a success. That is to say, it was still a failure. I don't think it's a coincidence that Erd's reaction to the storm is closer to Burton's than any other person's, and though she is not immune, she seems to retain some inkling that she had been something else prior, which leads to her constant drive to unveil her own truest nature. So then, if Erd is the incomplete prototype, then that would make Burton the finished product. Number 4. The identities of the narrators are the souls in the Book of 43. At the end of chapter 12, Igor hands Burton a heavy book, claiming that its contents were the weight of 43 souls, the people that he had brought to the Amber Room only for their souls to be stripped and their bodies left as empty husks. And I think it's possible that these 43 souls are the changing narrators. Now, this one is tenuous at best, since the only real evidence I can see for it are in traces, which, tend to be cryptic at the best of times. After the events of Note 24 of Chapter 12, the angry German lady seethes at him for entering her home with his bloody boots and tracking dirt everywhere. If we are to take this as a direct follow-up to the note, which, these narrator traces tend to be, she would then be referring to Igor, with her room then being the Amber Room. Furthermore, the narrators in general seem to have some degree of precognition, describing events before they even ever happen, with the most blatant example of this being the first trace of Chapter 6, where the old woman narrator describes the trajectory for both Chapter 6 and 7, albeit in sort of veiled metaphor. So, if we are going to take the previous theory of vessel ensoulment as a means of existing, or at least experiencing the existences across all of time, this makes some sense. In a way, these narrators would then share a quality with Beryl, who also happened to be a narrator of her own event, despite not being one of the 43. They are people who already know the trajectory of fate, having experienced it as an amalgam of the past, present, and future. Number 5. Burton is the vessel to be ensouled. Right. So one of the earliest theories for who the narrators are was that Burton was just a lunatic and these voices were in her head. I'm bringing this one back, however, rather than it being a result of her being mentally unwell, which, she is, but not in that way, she herself is the vessel of the 43. Now you might be saying, this doesn't work because the Amber Room experiments didn't begin until after the storm, yada yada yada. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter. The room is seemingly capable of transcending time. It's posited to be able to go to the future. Upon entering it for the first time, Burton speaks to Erd in the past, and yet Erd states that this conversation is something that has already happened. When it comes to the Amber Room, chronology may not be as absolute as one might think. Just because we haven't experienced it yet, it doesn't mean it hasn't already happened in the future. And finally, number 6. Burton is not Burton. The hell does that mean? Right, well, the thing about vessel ensoulment is that it kind of echoes a concept that we have seen before back in 3.2 of Flowing Feast. Feliciane falls into the depths of myth and is dissolved, however her soul is able to persist for a time, eventually latching onto Broom, before managing to temporarily take control of her body. In other words, a soul enshrining itself within a vessel, eventually, if, Broom hadn't expelled her, subsuming the original personality entirely. Now, I'm fairly certain that Burton was experimented on at some point. All of the signs point in that direction. There is, of course, her immediate reaction of falling into a trance upon entering the room for the first time and losing 12 hours, which, as far as we know, that's a reaction solely unique to her. There's also the fact that she mentions children being experimented on in the Foundation in Chapter 2, and while Arcana claims that this is a lie, and, maybe it is, how do we know that that lie doesn't have some grain of truth, right? She had veiled another lie in half-truths in that very same scene, so who's to say that isn't also the case here? Additionally, she also has that unexplained scar on her back, which Arcana seems very interested in, which makes me believe it is anything but mundane. It also just happens to align with the closed eye and moon motifs, which we have seen plenty of throughout the course of the story, and in her game piece model, that scar glows, which, even if that's more a visual representation, seems to be a very conspicuous detail to include, and it only ever really shows up in the Three Doors mode, which itself seems to be some sort of, meta dream space aligning with this idea of dreams being connected to the depths of myth presented in 3.2. So, if Burton was experimented on, and vessel ensoulment functions on a similar premise to Feliciane's possession, then what if the body is merely the vessel, and what resides within is something else entirely that just believes itself to be the true Burton? Maybe what is enshrined within the body is a wholly different person from the original inhabitant. Maybe it's even the true incarnation of Erd, or maybe it's not even human at all. Maybe it's even just a concept dredged up from the depths of myth. Erd and Burton share the namesakes of the Weavers of Fate, right? The Norse Norns. And if we're gonna get real crazy with it, maybe Burton herself is the literal concept of fate shoved into a mortal vessel. It would certainly align with the thread and spinning wheel imagery. Who knows? I certainly don't, but I do know that that is going to be it. I spent a bit of time thinking about how I wanted to structure this thing, but there really wasn't too terribly much I wanted to cover, and I didn't really feel like getting too flowery with it, so I just stuck with a list. Everyone loves a good list, right? I do kind of like this idea for, you know, shorter, less structured format as a way to just get half-baked ideas out there and then maybe, you know, expanding them into their own video later if we ever get further evidence. But, you know, that'll be all. If you like this video, comment, subscribe, like, all that stuff. And a thank you to my YouTube members, Bones and Apple, Pompe Aerostar, Amane Echo, and Der Puffer, my Patreon member, Paul A, and a special thank you to Amane Echo for the 30 gifted members, and Chip II for the 10 gifted members. It is very much appreciated. Thank you all. And for the rest of you, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one, alright? Bye-bye.